Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. So, we are going to continue our discussion on animal behavior, more specifically about learning, to talk about this term cognition. And cognition simply is the process of knowing that may include awareness, the ability to reason, the ability to um, recall information, and even potentially use some judgment. And probably, if I were to throw this term at you, if you had any basic understanding of what the term meant, the first thing you would think of is human cognition, being able to go to school, to learn, to reason, to problem solve. Um, and yet, it's not necessarily something that is unique to humans. Not that every organism is capable of cognition, but there are definitely way more organisms capable of it than you probably would think of off the top of your head. Honeybees, for example, are in the diagram here, and they can actually distinguish same versus different. And they learn that stimulus by utilizing, in this particular sense, the experiment here, looking at different food sources based on putting them behind the same pattern or the same color. And they were able to understand that these honeybees can, in fact, distinguish where that food reward is based on that particular pattern, which is kind of cool. And problem solving comes along with that cognition, the ability to strategize and overcome obstacles. And once again, not something that is wholly unique to humans. We look at birds, they are capable of problem solving to once again get to something important to them, and more often than not, that important thing is a food source. So they can pull up the strings and get the food at the end. Chimps, apes, are basically the next thing closest to humans on the evolutionary tree, and so it's no surprise that they are capable of problem solving as well. This particular little monkey here, chimpanzee, was able to recognize that if he stacked those boxes, that gave him the height enough to go ahead and be able to get to that food source on a string hanging from the ceiling. Again, sit down and watch young children if you have that opportunity, because they are incredibly interesting case studies for watching how that cognitive process builds, that problem solving process builds. I always like to tell the story of my younger sister, who is kind of like that chimp in the picture. She was very good at problem solving and getting to the Christmas cookies every year. We had our microwave stand next to the fridge, and my mom used to try to hide the cookies on top of the refrigerator until she figured out that if she moved enough chairs and boxes and step ladders that she was able to get a hold of in the kitchen, that she could get onto the microwave stand and then crawl from the microwave stand up to top of the refrigerator, only for my mother at one point to find her sitting on top of our fridge in the middle of December eating Christmas cookies out of the container my mom thought was way out of her reach. While we're still on the topic of learning, there are a lot of ways for organisms to learn, whether it's understanding spatial relations, whether it's being able to learn in sort of more of a traditional sense, like we're used to talking about with school. It's the problem solving, um, being able to just recognize patterns. But overarchingly, tons and tons of learning occurs through social observation. Once again, watch those kids. They learn everything by watching others. They observe what their parents are doing. They observe what their siblings are doing. They observe what their peers are doing. For better or worse, they're learning things through observation and watching others do what they do. So this particular picture is of a young chimp who is learning to crack nuts with stones, and they're just watching the older chimps in their environment do this, and they eventually figure out how to do that as well. And if we talk about culture for a second, so this sort of system of information, this transfer of teachings that influence our behavior in a given population, it's social learning that really is the root of that. It alters behavior, it influences fitness of an individual when we talk about animals, but even humans. All right, we talk about our cultures, and if you look at different ethnicities around the globe, they have different cultures. It's because of what their society has determined was necessary, probably even going back as far as evolutionary history. Somewhere it's rooted in the benefit of the fitness of the individuals, and as a result, the fitness of the population as a whole, that certain behaviors were good. Now, certainly those have evolved and changed over time, as we're not necessarily foragers or scavengers anymore. But that culture all comes down to, why do you know to behave in a certain way in a certain situation? Because you've watched other people do it. While we're still on the topic of behavioral processes, let's talk a little bit about this idea of foraging behavior. So foraging behavior is, once again, probably something rooted in some of that social understanding, that cognition, but it's the ability to recognize and search for and eat certain food items. So go back to natural selection, and clearly natural selection is going to benefit optimizing these foraging behaviors. It's going to refine these behaviors to enhance the ability for those organisms to get food at a level that is sustainable for them without over expending energy. So this particular diagram is looking at data from a fruit fly experiment. Drosophila melanogaster is the scientific name for fruit flies. And what these particular scientists were able to distinguish is that there's a variation in a particular gene that actually dictates the foraging behavior in the larva of these fruit flies. So the larva with a particular allele will travel further while foraging than larvae with the alternative allele. So larvae in these high density populations benefit from going further out for food because they'll have to compete less for it, while those larvae in those low density populations actually benefit from being a shorter distance forager because they're not expending excess energy. They don't need to compete for food because there's not enough individuals really around for it to be necessary to outcompete. And so it actually is more evolutionarily beneficial for them to stay close and save the energy. But when you've got high competition going on, being able to recognize the need to go further based on this genetic connection is actually more beneficial for them. So there's this whole idea of this optimal foraging model, which really is taking the view of that foraging behavior and comparing the compromises that that particular species needs to make between the benefits of the nutrition it's getting from the food and the cost that it takes to obtain it. So when we look at the cost benefit ratio to foraging, clearly the benefit is the food and the nutrition and the sugars and all that sort of thing that you need in order to be able to be functional for your metabolism to do everything else, find a mate, reproduce, so on and so forth. All of that takes energy, and the energy is going to ultimately come from your food. That being said, there are definitely costs with foraging, getting your food, the energy that it takes in and of itself to be expended to obtain the food, but then there's also the risk of being out of, more than likely, some sort of safety net of an environment. You've got to kind of put yourself out there in order to get access to that food, and so you are at risk of being eaten. Unless you're at the top of the food chain, there's generally some sort of prey. You or somebody else's prey. So natural selection clearly is going to favor the minimizing of the cost while maximizing the benefit of that foraging behavior that that species does, and that's what the idea of this optimal foraging model is. How did that species evolve to mitigate the risks while maximizing the benefit? And in this particular diagram, we're looking at these northwestern crows who have to drop their mollusks from a particular height in order to break the shell and feed on the soft parts of the mollusks inside. And there's a definite trade off. The higher and higher that crow goes, the more likely that the dropping of that mollusk will result in a broken shell and access to the food. However, it expends energy the further that it has to fly high. So there is definitely a cost benefit in terms of how high that bird flies versus the ability to definitely get that mollusk to crack open and have access to the food.